Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell.
It's nice when childhood friends have the same kind of life. Michael thought as he drove to the restaurant where Charles was waiting for him. If Charles were less successful, what would they have to talk about? Rich people can't be friends with poor people, even if they want to. It doesn't work out. Envy interferes here, an involuntary demonstration of prosperity. And what is the worst of all is the realization that your friend, with whom you fished for moths in childhood, is a common lazy and weakling? Yes, Michael, by the time he was 35 years old, had acquired several unshakable beliefs. The first and most important of them said that poverty in 8 cases out of 10, the consequence of laziness and lack of character, but fortunately, all this was not about him and Charles. Each had risen in his own way. Michael ran his own contemporary dance theater. Charles' business was darker, but in the end, it was the one that would survive any crisis. Charles owned a funeral home. Yes, the festive atmosphere of the Michael Theater is not comparable, but it's also a necessary business. How can you stand it all? Michael once asked a friend. After all, every day you come to work, and there are coffins, morgue, makeup artists' dead makeup, and loved ones weeping in the ritual hall. That can make you depressed, can't it? Charles shrugged. Depressed? Maybe you can get depressed, but personally, I prefer to get philosophical. People die whether we want them to or not. So the employees do their best to see a person off with dignity and cause as little trouble to their loved ones as possible. They can mourn their loss in peace. Don't think it's better to be distracted. Then you won't feel the pain. First of all, lying, and secondly, pain is important to feel, Michael. You know how it often happens. A person drives his grief inside, tries to drown it out with troubles, and then bang, and the asylum. It's just as important to be able to grieve as it is to be able to rejoice. That's what I think. And we give those who have had such grief a chance to experience it without being distracted by things like finding a costume for the deceased, finding a makeup artist, or finding a place in the cemetery. After listening to his friend's speech, Michael didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. Charles was right. It was just that not everyone could accept his almost philosophical truth. Just in case, Michael decided not to talk to his friend any more about his work. After all, they had enough to talk about. Charles was waiting for him, passing the time with a glass of wine and a telephone conversation. He was probably dealing with some issues related to his monstrous business. But when he saw his friend, he immediately hung up the phone and stood up. "Hello, Michael." The old friends hugged. "Look at you, you haven't abandoned the gym." Michael smirked, poking his fist into Charles's steel biceps. "Do you want to be young forever?" "I can't keep up with you." He was not in debt. "Good for you." "Still doing Botox, and I still do not dare." "I'm sorry." Michael sighed with courtly sadness. "Nobody gets any younger. You've already got silver in your hair, and I think you'll be bald soon." It was a typical exchange of courtesies, which no meeting was without. Having finished with this introductory part, the friends finally sat down at the table. "Did you call me here for nothing, or for business?" Michael asked. "But why do I ask? It is clear that it was business. Otherwise, I would have come just to visit, right?" "Right." Charles smiled. "I've got something to do with you, and it's strictly male. Your Betty doesn't need to know about it. You see, I met this girl a few months ago." Michael chuckled understandingly. "And now you don't know how to break up with her?" "You guessed." But Charles shook his head. "No, I know that, but this is different." He began to tell the story slowly, in detail, and Michael, listening to his friend, suddenly remembered their childhood together. Charles had always been like that, trying to consider every situation in detail, taking into account all the circumstances, and only then to decide something. There was no spontaneity in him, but he always made a very balanced decision and was rarely wrong. Do you remember when I decided to take a vacation at Christmas? Charles told me. I went to Thailand for 2 weeks. It was beaches, clubs, beaches. I met her at one of the clubs. Pretty girl, legs, breasts. A stripper dancer? Michael asked. Charles nodded. Yeah, well, you know, they're at work, and it's forbidden to show affection. But I could see that she was looking at me. She liked me. All right, I guess I don't care. I'm a free man. I waited until she came home from work, and that's how we met. She turns out to be American. Name's Nancy. And of course, she didn't go into this dance for the good life. And that's where it all started. And then I said to her, "Why are you hanging around here?" "Why don't you come with me?" She agreed. I got her an apartment and everything was fine for a month and a half, and then I realized it wasn't my thing. Yeah, she got cold too. I could see that. And it started, she doesn't like everything and everything is boring and cold. Anyway, it's time for us to break up. Well, I don't get it, Michael. So break up. What's stopping you? Charles didn't answer at once, sipped more wine, thought for a moment. You see, he finally said, Nancy is from a small town, simple family. I've shown her a beautiful life, and now I'm going to leave her. What's she gonna do? She's gonna look for a richer daddy and end up in a dump? You know how it is, don't you? I'd really like her to have something she likes to do, to live a decent life, respecting herself. And there, you see, she'll find a good, proper guy, a family will be formed. She once said that she always dreamed of dancing in some decent place. Maybe there's a place for her in your theater. Michael thought for a moment. I'm more on the commercial side of things, Charles. He said that he's in charge of choreography. We seem to have a full company, but I'd like to see your Nancy. Maybe we can put her somewhere, at least in the Corps de Ballet, and then if she shows herself. Charles smiled. I knew you'd say that. That's why I asked you to come. She's on her way. Michael suddenly noticed that a tall brunette in a red dress was approaching their table. He went up to meet her and froze, unable to say anything. Wonderful dark hair fell in waves on her shoulders. Her coffee-colored eyes with raised corners attracted, lured, promised. And the girl also had magically beautiful golden skin. Is that her? Hoarsely, he asked Charles. Is that her? The girl walked over to them and leaned over to kiss Charles on the cheek. What Michael noticed at that deep cleavage made his breath hitch. Meet Nancy, said Charles. This is my old friend Michael. He runs the Contemporary Dance Theater. The beautiful girl turned to Michael and cast a languid glance at him from under her thick lashes. Charles told me about you. Her voice was soft and intimate, as if she were whispering with him in the bedroom between kisses rather than greeting a stranger. I've been wondering about you too. He awkwardly popped up from the table to pull back a chair for Nancy. Allow me to sit down. The girl thanked him with a smile, and that smile made Michael almost physically feel the tickling sparks run through his body. This had never happened to him before, never. He didn't notice his friend's anxious gaze on him, didn't notice the waiters smirking visibly as they passed their table. You, Charles, said you were a dancer. Nancy, let's not talk about that. Charles interrupted her. The bar and the forfeitures are in the past. We're here to think about how we can get you back to dancing. Michael, who until then had been serving as if mesmerized, seemed to stumble over these words. Really, how? To do it bypassing Betty was impossible. then how should he be? Lose Nancy, that bird of paradise? Not at all. He must find a way to keep her with him. We'll think of something, he promised the girl. Tomorrow, say, by 11 o'clock, come to the theater, show yourself to our ballet master, and we'll think together what we can do for you. Now I must go too. Charles came up at once. Nancy, you stay. Order whatever you like. Have it put on my account. They went outside, and Michael was surprised to note that it was already dark. He had lost track of time. But of course he had kept his eyes on Nancy, so where could he have seen anything? Betty must be waiting. He muttered unhappily, thinking of his wife. Michael. Charles looked at him shrewdly. You have a great wife. You remember that? Okay. Don't forget that. Michael became alarmed. Was he so obviously in love that even Charles had noticed? That's the last thing we need. Why did he just say that? He asked, trying to convey in his voice the surprise of a faithful husband who was suddenly suspected, unjustly of course, of sympathizing with a strange woman. Charles did not hold back a chuckle. As a man, I understand you. He answered calmly. Anyone would fall for Nancy. I've been through it myself. But I'll tell you frankly, it's too expensive to take her seriously. She's not worth a Betty Nail. Don't be mad. I'm being friendly. Are you trying to piss me off in a friendly way? Michael grinned. Come on, I'm not stupid. I wouldn't trade my Nancy for anyone. Okay, bye. I'll say hello to my wife for you. Nancy picked at her salad with her fork without interest and pushed her plate away. There was no appetite at all. This Michael had obviously had his eye on her. Now he would do anything to get her a job in his theater. Now it was important to play her cards right, to keep his attention, and most importantly, to warm him up, not being stingy with advances. Then soon she will become not just a pretty puppet, as it has been so far, but a significant, wealthy person. It was a pity, of course, that Charles would have to be parted with. She liked him, but he was too independent, not easy to control. But Michael, something told her, would be the kind of man she could make ropes out of, and that was just what she needed. Nancy nodded to the waiter. Take the salad away and bring me a bolognese with mushrooms in a cream sauce and a red wine of your choice. I don't know anything about alcohol. Anything else? The waiter asked politely. Cucumber and tomato salad, shouted Nancy, with greens and mayonnaise dressing. Don't ask stupid questions and carry my order. Her mood improved a little. Life is a zebra. Not long ago, she was striptease dancing and living in a filthy doghouse on the backside of civilization, and then she met Charles, and now she lives in a nice, albeit small, apartment and dines at a restaurant. That's great. And when she realized she was losing interest in Charles, she didn't have time to feel bad, but Michael came along. And with him, she's got a good chance of making a name for herself. No, this was definitely working out very well. Nancy took a sip of wine and smiled. This wine was good. Tart, moderately sweet, and at least it was a reminder of what living people ate and drank. Dancers are supposed to watch their figure, but how human is that? Eating nothing but chicken breast or leaf lettuce? In her youth, Nancy loved fries, as Michael had expected. Betty was beginning to worry. Of course she didn't make a scene. It wasn't in her nature. Michael couldn't remember if there had been any fights in their married life. It seemed they had never had any. Now Betty was reading a book quietly and showed no signs of irritation at the sight of her husband. I was beginning to worry a little in case something happened. She smiled. Why didn't you call? I'm sorry, Nancy. Michael touched her cheek lightly with his lips. Nancy, so simple, so warm, like the cornflower that grows by the house. You look at it and you feel better, because it's familiar, it's native, it's familiar. Even the appearance of his wife was some kind of peaceful nose, lips, hair, no sharp line, no bright contrasts. Blue eyes, russet waves of hair, skin, a little touched with tan, everything in moderation, all harmonious. That's what he always said about Betty, or maybe she just wasn't any good. Out of the blue, Michael thought, and was startled by the thought. No, that's nonsense. Nancy is great. Loyal, honest, hardworking. Constant after all, and that's a lot by our standards. Yes, women like that are worth their weight in gold. This inner monologue calmed him down a little, and Michael even managed to smile at his wife. "I am so happy when you are waiting for me at home," he said almost sincerely. "I was late because Charles took me to a cafe in the evening. I was on my way home when he intercepted me." Well, she seemed genuinely upset. "Charles, why didn't you ask him to come over? It's been 100 years since we've seen each other. A childhood friend. Don't be angry with him." Michael laughed. "He'd like to see you too, and he sends his regards to you. But you see, this time he'd had a request, a delicate one in general. So he was sure you'd say no. By the way, I'm sure of it too, and I told him that right away, but he made me promise that I'd talk to you anyway." "What kind of a request is that?" "What did he want? Help hide a body, rob a bank, what?" No, it's much simpler than that. He wanted a girl he knew to join our troop." "Who's the girl?" Betty asked. Here it was necessary to be very careful not to arouse the slightest suspicion. Michael poured himself some water and sat down across from his wife. "I think it's his mistress," he said nonchalantly. "I didn't ask for details, but I guessed something. He pulled her out of some back alley, cleaned her up, fed her. Charles says it would be good to put her to work, so you know, how long before trouble? It's a pity, isn't it? But if he's so worried about her, the wife says he could help her get an education, then get a job. Michael, I understand and even support Charles. He is good that he doesn't want to leave the girl to her fate, but why does he want to place her with us? And she dreams of dancing with us, and she seems to have some training. I don't think she's that talented, but a friend asked her to do it. You should see her tomorrow. Maybe we can find something for her." Well, Nancy drummed her knuckles on the table thoughtfully, beat out some kind of dance rhythm. "If Charles asked me to, I'll try to do something and stick it somewhere. So you're saying hardly a talent? Well, what about her looks, or you haven't seen her?" "Why not?" "I have." Michael nodded. "But to be honest, I didn't pay much attention. What am I supposed to do? Notice all the Charles women. She must be pretty. So we have a deal. Will you put her with us?" Betty shrugged. "I can't promise a concert lineup," she said, "but let her come in, rehearse. We'll start with the Corps de Ballet and see how she does." "Thank you, darling." Michael shone. "Then I'll rinse and go to bed. I'm tired." Only when he was alone, locked in the bathroom, could he finally relax and congratulate himself on his victory. Betty, apparently, did not suspect anything, even promised to help. This, of course, was not without mentioning the magical Charles name. Yes, childhood friendships either end with childhood or last a lifetime. But the important thing was, it all worked out. He'd had that dangerous conversation with his wife, and he'd won. Well, that's great. Good for him. Michael realized that today he hadn't just managed to fool his wife. He had fulfilled his friend's request, and at the same time he had gotten Nancy in close proximity to him. Now she would be there for him. Strangely enough, he was thinking of her calmly now, without fever. This girl was so impossibly beautiful it seemed like a dream. Perhaps tomorrow, when they saw each other again, he would wonder what he had found in this sweet, but in general ordinary girl yesterday. After all, it was likely that in the daylight it would appear that she had a pimple on her forehead, or even several, or that her lips were peeling. Michael thought about it and hoped that that was exactly what would happen. Never in his life had he thought he would be so eager for disappointment. But it was the only thing that could help now, because if tomorrow's meeting didn't disappoint him, how could he live then? And Nancy, the nightmare came again. She returns to her native town, but finds it deserted. The houses on the streets familiar from her childhood stand with their windows open in winter, and behind them there is darkness and silence. And it is immediately clear that there is no one there, not a soul. Only an old merry-go-round creaking in the yard and spinning by itself, as if ghosts were riding on it. At this point, Nancy always woke up and lay with her eyes open for a long time, still hearing that frightening, dead creak. This damned dream wore her nerves out at intervals of about once every few months, and she couldn't get used to it. Tonight's nightmare was unusual. There were new details in it. Walking through the empty city, Nancy kept turning around, someone calling her name. She still couldn't recognize the voice, though it seemed familiar. And then suddenly, unexpectedly, she realized that these responses someone's evil joke, to frighten her completely, so that she would never be able to leave this place. She decided to ignore them then, but whoever had come up with this prank wasn't stupid either. Now she was distracted from all sides, and the voices calling for her multiplied, echoing, giggling. Nancy squatted down beside the very creaking carousel and covered her ears with her hands. And then she woke up. "I'm never going back there," she thought. Over and over she said that soothing mantra, and it usually worked, but today something went wrong. Nancy tangled herself in the blanket and went into the kitchen. Tea. The girl promised herself. Strong, with milk and sugar and cookies. She wanted to chase away the cold sadness of her dream, to warm herself, to remind herself of the present, of the troubled city outside the window, of the chocolate chip cookies, of being in the past. It's like you're here and not here. Charles once said, like you're in two worlds at once. Nonsense. She smiled. She didn't want to admit that he was right, even to herself. And that's the way she lived. That's right. There was an outside world in which you had to be able to spin to get anywhere, and another world that Nancy never told anyone about. In that secret world of hers, her favorite cat, Marquise, was alive, and a shaggy black dog ran around the yard barking. There, in summer, lupines and lion's eye grew along the fence, and in winter, the snow was white as a downy blanket. Nancy, a girl from the suburbs, in a chintz sundress and sandals, was tilling the beds and looking at the gate. Soon her friend would come to pick her up, and together they would run to the dance class at the local House of Culture. She had once met Mason there after a concert. She hurried down the stairs, and as if she ran into an invisible wall when she saw him. How handsome he was! Blue eyes like the sea she had only seen in pictures. He was so tall that she had to throw her head back to look at his face. Mason noticed this and went down a couple of steps. "I saw you on stage," he said, smiling. The smile was so cheeky that Nancy laughed. "He's a lousy liar and he doesn't care." "What dress was I wearing?" she asked, hoping to catch him out, but the trick failed. "Red." The boy answered without hesitation. "You had a flower pinned behind your ear." "Right here." He jokingly tugged on her ear. "Come on, I'll walk you home." It's getting late." He threw his jacket over her shoulders, took her hand, and led her home like a little girl. It was so unusual, funny, but also very, very exciting. Nancy saw the eager curiosity with which the passing girls looked at Mason. She was walking down the street for the first time with a young man who was not her, neither relative nor classmate, walking straight as a couple. Awkwardly, she joked, "So we are a couple." Mason answered as if he took it for granted, and then when it was dark, they kissed for a long time at the gate of the Nancy house, and the girl didn't care that now rumors were sure to spread around their private sector. Let them talk. What did it matter if the most long-awaited adventure in the world, love, happened to you? Within a week they were considered both bride and groom, and after another month, Mason climbed over the fence at night and knocked on their sleeping bedroom window. "What?" she asked in her sleep, but when she saw Mason's pale face with drops of sweat on his forehead, she realized, "There's trouble. I've lost my money, Nancy." He barely uttered it, his lips quivering. The girl silently poured water into a mug and handed it to him. The guy greedily drank the water to the drop and wiped his mouth with the palm of his hand. He said, "I'll give it to you, you fool. So give it back." She still didn't know what he was talking about. "Give it back and be done with it." Mason groaned, clutching his head. "What kind of a fool are you, Nancy? I have no money. I played on credit. Now if I don't pay it back, I'll be cut to pieces." "All right." He took a breath and looked at Nancy with sore, inflamed eyes. "The thing is, Nancy, I've got to go away today now." "I'm sorry, okay? Forget it." "Wait." Nancy touched his forehead and wiped away the sweat. "Wait, Mason, what do you mean, forget it? How much money do they need?" "I'll get it." "Where?" He shouted in a whisper. "Where will you get it?" "Tell me where. We'll find them somewhere." She threw off her nightgown and in a minute was standing dressed to go out. "Let's go," she called out in a whisper. "Let's go out the window." The only man with money the girl knew was the choreographer of their dance club, William. Where did he get the money from? No one really knew. True, it was said that he distilled moonshine and sold it, but Nancy paid no attention to these conversations. Moonshine existed outside her world, and so did the people who needed it. "William." She knocked on the choreographer's window. There was a light on and voices coming from the room. "Is he having company?" "William, it's Nancy." Mason hissed something indistinctly. "Nancy?" "Yeah, shut up," she whispered at him. "William, I have a favor to ask of you. I have no one else to go to, please." The window opened. "What do you want, Nancy?" The choreographer asked unhappily. "You're making a racket in the middle of the night under an honest man's window." "William, I want money." Nancy blurted it out without saying anything in vain. The room outside the window was filled with men's laughter. William waved his hand carelessly at his guests, and all was quiet. "I need some." The girl continued. "I need... Mason, how much do you need?" She looked over her shoulder, but she didn't see her friend. "Mason!" She yelled across the street, forgetting the time of day. "Mason! Mason! There he is," the choreographer said calmly, seeing the pale, shaking fellow peering out from around the corner of the house. William looked with visible disgust at Mason's lanky figure and disheveled hair. "U.S. Shoal! Here she is, running around at night in other people's houses, looking for money to borrow. And you're afraid to show your face in public. Is that you?" He turned to Nancy. "Because of him, he needs money?" The girl nodded. "All right, hang on. I'll be right out." "Come on, Nancy." Pulled her sleeve by the guy, She silently pulled her arm out. The door opened and William, dressed in a homemade tracksuit, stepped leisurely onto the porch. "And he's for you, maiden, you're my red one." He began, glaring at the boy's haggard face. "Did he tell you who he owed what to?" "No, it's nothing. I'll tell you that. He owes me, Nancy. And you're a fool. You'd better go to bed than run around at night. No one forced him to play. It was his own fault. Let him clean up his own mess." "William, I'll do it." Nancy said firmly, "Would you like me to clean for you, come to your house? I can cook and tend the garden, and you'll die of old age before you pay off his." The choreographer pointed his finger at the silent Mason. "Debt, and he'll make new ones in the meantime, that you'll always have to work for his foolishness. Do you know what a gambler is, Nancy? Take some good advice. Go home to bed, lie down and forget it. Forget that ashhole." "I won't," she shouted. "You, William, what have you got in your life besides work?" "No wife, no kids, and I know you're in love. So why can't you see who you've fallen in love with? There's your beloved standing there, silent. He's the one who's setting you up right now. He's not the one who's thinking about how to get money, and he's not the one who's offering to work it off. It's you. And he's standing there like a lamb of God, offended, waiting for you to do everything for him. You're a total, all right. He cut himself off. You can't hear a damn thing. All right, you want to help him, I'll send you overseas. I got a friend who runs a bar there. You'll work for him as a dancer. He'll give you a place to live. You won't have to pay for it. We'll split your salary, half for you to live on, half for your dog's debts. Do you agree? No? Make up your mind quickly. People are waiting for me. Agreed?" Nancy didn't hesitate. And only then, on the way home, she suddenly realized that now there was no turning back. Soon she would leave here, and for 2 years she would not see these streets, or her room, or her lover, not even her cat and dog, and those she would not see. Mason walked silently along beside her. Nancy longed for him to encourage her, to say something affectionate, or at least to take her hand. But he kept on walking, raking the gravel with his feet, and sighing heavily from time to time. "Will you wait for me?" The girl asked timidly. He only sniffed his nose. "Where could I go?" "I'll wait for you, of course. When you come back, we'll get married." Nancy smiled slightly, married. Now it would be a little easier for her to get through these 2 years. It's always easier when there's something to look forward to. The gravel under their feet rustled a little too loudly for a summer night. She'd given the house she lived in to Mason, and not without a hidden agenda. Let everything around it remind him of her. Nancy had hoped her lover would call her every day, but alas, there was trouble with that. She called more often, and the fiancé said he had something urgent to do. "I got a job at the motor pool." Reluctantly, he said into the phone. "Well, you have to work. What's to live on?" "Okay, Nancy, I have to send the guys on a trip, bye." She felt she couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. She wanted to drop everything to go home, but what was left of her paycheck was only enough for the most meager of meals. The owner of David's bar smiled wickedly at her requests for a raise. "You see, Nancy, I'm not making any profit. I don't get many customers, only locals. What can I get out of them? You know we feed off tourists, and it's the off-season. Where am I going to scrape you up?" And then he lowered his voice. "You figure it out? The other girls will find out I'm paying you more. They'll demand a pay raise for themselves. What am I, an oligarch, a Danish prince? No, Nancy. Don't you even come to me with that question. Vaughn, you want to have a drink on me? Let's call it a night." Luckily, some 10th darling, Charles, came out to their rundown bar, and seeing the beautiful stripper in no time, arranged everything with David. A few days later, Nancy was already pacing the dusty, nothing here in 2 years has changed, road to her house. The gate was unlocked. Nancy entered the yard and did not hear a cheerful dog barking, and the dog kennel had gone somewhere. She looked around confused, not recognizing her home nest, and didn't immediately understand what had happened here. The hulk of the house, burned black, stuck out in front of the girl, and only the surviving porch was almost untouched by the fire. And on this porch, she had once liked to sit with a mug of milk and a piece of bread. The porch was dear to her. Except now, it led nowhere. "You're back. Haven't seen you in a while." Nancy looked back and saw her neighbor at the gate. Yeah, nothing's changed. And Aunt Miranda is still the same round, and her kerchief on her head is still the same, white with a pretty blue flower. Nothing changes and everything changes. "Hello, Miranda." "What's this here?" The woman sighed heavily and waved her hand. "Can't you see?" "Oh, trouble, trouble. It's your Mason." Drunkenly set afire. The whole street piled in. They barely put it out. They helped the firemen. "How?" "He was out here with some girls." Nancy shuddered. "Who with?" "You're lying, Aunt Miranda. And shame on you, you're a grown woman." But the neighbor was not embarrassed. "Ask anyone." She gestured around the street. "As soon as you left, he started walking the devil. And then he burned down the whole house and went into the bushes. And you say I'm lying." "They say." "What do they say?" The girl interrupted. "Aunt Miranda?" "What?" "They say, what's there to hide? They say he married a rich woman, the market director's daughter. Lisa, is that her? She's fat, fat, fat. Why should she be thin if she's not poor? Why not eat with Daddy's money?" The whole town was buzzing at their wedding at the best restaurant in town. Mason was unrecognizable. He used to be a simple guy, and now he's looking down, saying hello through his lip. And that Lisa, the fat girl, she's all over him, just clinging to him. "Huddle, you say?" She remembered Lisa from their dance class. She was a fat, clumsy girl who couldn't repeat even the simplest movements, but for some reason she was always included in the concert lineups and was even given leading parts. Of course, the girls whispered among themselves, but no one openly resented her. Everyone knew who Lisa's daddy was, and they also knew that once a week on Saturdays, a car driven by the market directors came to their house of culture and began the planned distribution of delicacies. There and the director of the House of Culture and choreographers and even janitors. Even the alcoholic janitor was not forgotten. She necessarily brought 2 bottles of white and red wine, a few bottles of vodka, and necessarily beer bottle 10. Such an island of abundance in a separate House of Culture. And this is the coffer her Mason married? And she's the one clinging to him? I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Nancy muttered. Aunt Miranda nodded sorrowfully. That's the thing about us. Believe it or don't believe it. I'm just telling it like it was. Dad sent them on a honeymoon, too. That's what my friend told me. You know she works at the airport. She saw them there herself. She issued the tickets for them, and they have the same surname now, and she saw the rings with her own eyes. I see, Nancy replied dryly. Where were they flying to? The neighbor hesitated. I don't remember. I'm sort of in the... But what do you mean? With a T? I think it's a word. Thailand? That's what the girl said. Thailand. Thank you for the story. Aunt Miranda, I'll be off. The woman looked after her, furrowing her brow and whispering something silently. Either she was praying for something, or she was reading. With Mason, they, strangely enough, met the same day. On the way out of town, Nancy stopped for gas. Suddenly, she saw Mason in a nearby auto. He turned at the sight of her, and his face contorted with annoyance. "Holy shit," it came out of his mouth. Nancy, ignoring this peculiar greeting, nodded discreetly. "Hello, Mason." "Good day to you, too. I see you're back already. How did you like it in Thailand?" "As for me, it's a bit hot there, and insects can bite. Your wife didn't complain, did she?" He averted his eyes. "Why are you organizing all this?" he asked reproachfully. "Why? Don't you understand anything?" He spoke so tiredly and so disappointed. "I don't understand." Nancy raised her voice. "But I understand the other thing very well. I understand that I spent almost 2 years twisting my ass in front of a drunk to pay off your car debts. I also realized that I ate every meal and lived in a room with cockroaches, but I thought it was nothing. My sweet Mason is waiting for me at home. I realized that I was counting small things. I forgot about sleepy rest and thought about everything. I don't care. My darling is waiting for me at home, and my darling burned down my house. So I don't have a home anymore. And my lover doesn't bother me either. And why should he think about me now? He has a different social circle than before. And he married someone else. That's what I mean. And what are you talking about? No, I don't understand. I've become stupid. Did I ask you to do that?" He exploded. "Did I ask you to do that? Think about it. You made up your own mind. And now it's my fault. You know what, Nancy, you better blame yourself. Don't confuse me with that. You're a sacrificial lamb. You traded your maiden honor for your lover, and he didn't appreciate it. I'm weeping from injustice." Finishing his furious tirade, Mason took a snow-white handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his forehead with it. "You're making my blood pressure rise," he said pitifully. "And I told you you'd wait," said the girl, and her voice treacherously trembled. "I said I'd come and we'd get married." Mason grinned cynically and harshly, which made his face, so still beautiful and young, disfigured and as if at once aged. "What did you think I was supposed to say? That I didn't want a prostitute fiancée? That the girl I loved for a moment decided stripping was a good thing? That it was a disrespectful thing to marry her? Is that what I'm supposed to tell you? All right, Nancy, that's it. We've had our talk and that's it. Go where you're going." So that was the end of the story, Nancy thought. As if it wasn't about her first love, but about a book she'd read. Nancy never once allowed herself to cry, though tears choked her all the way back. And then, when she was already sitting in the apartment she had rented and waiting for Charles, they met once more, and again quite by chance. Nancy and Charles were at the theater, and suddenly Nancy caught someone's gaze from a nearby box. Looking closer, she recognized Mason surrounded by his new family. His wife's parents, eager to look like avid theatergoers and therefore pompous to the point of ridiculousness. The wife, Lisa, was there, still as fat and thickly made up as before, except that she was wearing more diamonds. She clutched tightly the hand of her beloved husband, Mason, and minute by minute she was fixing his hair or shaking off invisible dust from his shoulder. She did not look at the stage at all. Mason was obviously bored. In addition to the fact that he was drawn to the ceremonial image, his hand now and then flew to his throat to loosen the knot of his tie. And, as Nancy noticed, he wasn't used to jackets either. He was always fidgeting with his sleeves and could never get comfortable. Once, when he took his wife's hand away from his hair, he looked at his own palm squeamishly. Social life was new to all of them. Charles leaned over and whispered in her ear, "Who's that guy?" "He's in the next box, staring at you." Nonsense, she whispered back, a classmate. At intermission, Nancy left the box and immediately ran into Mason. It was as if he'd been waiting for her there. Watching, he smiled. Aren't you lost in this life? Social life, theaters, ballets found my place in the big city. I wish you the same. The girl chirped carefree. Mason remained unperturbed. Who's that in the box with you? Daddy? He's all right, but he's old, Nancy, old. You're losing your touch. Does he keep you on your money, though? Spoils you. As much as he spoils you with your piggy bank. By the way, are you living well under her watchful eye? I hope you haven't run up any new debts, have you? Mason shrank back at these words, and Nancy saw his fingers fidget, fumbling along the buttons of his jacket. So you're in debt again. Satisfied, the girl said, and returned to her box. Late that night, Mason, frankly drunk and miserable, began to cut off her cell phone. I didn't want to marry Lisa. He scratched the phone. Believe it, Nancy, I even thought about running away. But her father has money, and you know what I am. A gambling addict who burned down my house. Nancy said coldly, Oh, yes, I was so ashamed of you. You did it for me, and I couldn't wait for you. And I couldn't play the game. You know how I sit down to play? I think I'm gonna get lucky, and then I'll be on the first plane to Thailand, pick you up, and we'll get married. Nancy, can you hear me, Nancy? I can, she said. And then, after I got married, I was afraid to meet you. I was ashamed to the point of having nightmares about you. My wife took me by the scruff of the neck and took me to the doctors. I spent a month in a psychiatric hospital. They all examined me, twisted and turned, and so gave me some pills, but the dreams did not stop. I just stopped being afraid of them, that's all. She grinned. Then they let me out after all, and I smelled that I would see you soon. I was walking and frightened of my own shadow. I thought you might pop out of every corner, but we met at a gas station. Nancy, don't believe what I told you the other day. I'm sick to my stomach myself. You know, remember, I only loved you as best I could, but you alone. He finally passed out. Maybe his phone had just gone dead, and Nancy put the receiver away with relief. Loved me, didn't love me. What did it matter now? There was nothing left. No more love, no more home to return to, nothing but nightmares. But since then, and settled in her heart, this fierce hatred of rich people who did not know the humiliation that fell to her share. If only I had money then, lots of money, she often thought. I wouldn't have had to go to Thailand. There would have been no striptease and no nightmarish return to my hometown where no one wanted me. And how dare Mason treat me like that? Yeah, he was an asshole. That's true. But if I was a rich chick, I wouldn't even know it. We'd be married, and he'd carry me around in his arms like he carries his Lisa now. Wouldn't it be nice to go back there in a different way? A rich girl who's throwing her money around left and right. Then he'd come to me on his knees and beg me to forgive him. Michael, it's impossible to work anymore. Betty complained. Her husband looked up from his papers. Betty in the theater always respected the subordination and never broke into the office of her husband, bypassing the secretary. And the fact that she called him simply by his first name already told him that the wife could barely contain herself. What is it, Betty? He asked sympathetically. Sit down, maybe some coffee. Would you like some? Listen, Michael, she said in a voice ringing with anger. I took this young lady into the company at her request, as agreed in the Corps de Ballet, but she is late for an hour for every rehearsal. She's rude to the choreographers, behaves like a lady. I'm not even talking about her data. She moves in a clumsy way. Okay, that can be fixed, but you have to work for it. You've got to work, Michael, not chill out. Anyway, Betty finally sat down in the chair she was offered. I don't know what to do with her. She's mean to the girls. She's had 2 fights in the locker room, tardiness, but I've already talked about that. The other day before yesterday, I was walking down the stairs and the cleaning lady was mopping the floors. And what did Nancy do? She kicked the bucket and went on her way, happy. A whole bucket of dirty water, Michael. What do you suggest? Fire her? Betty shrugged her shoulders. I don't know. Fire her. Charles might take offense. Leave things the way they are. Well, no, you can't do that either. I've just been exhausted for 2 months. We've got an opening night coming up, and it takes half my energy to get Nancy to behave. I'm just so tired. And then you know as well as I do, if you have someone like that on the team, they all talk. One lousy sheep spoils the whole flock. Michael listened to his wife, nodding in time with her words. All right, he said conciliatingly. Let me try to talk to her myself. Maybe she'll hear me at least. What do you say? But I wouldn't count on much if I were you. Betty got up and went to the door. Send her to me. Michael asked. Okay. Nancy showed up a couple minutes later, swaying her hips in the office, making Michael immediately hot. What kind of girl is that? Everyone goes to rehearsals dressed plainly, but look at this one. Scarlet t-shirt so stretched on the chest that not even an hour will crack, and these pants are hers. Everything you can and can't do is in plain sight. Bullying kitten? Michael smiled and came closer to hug her. The girl didn't like the idea. Your house mouse told me you wanted to see me, she said, sitting down in the chair. Betty. Michael corrected her. All right. The girl agreed. She threw off her shoes and put her feet up on the table. Your room mouse, Betty, said you wanted to see me. And what was that for? Michael covered the girl's bare feet with the palm of his hand. You can't be so careless, Nancy. He said, what if someone hears you? Let them hear, she purred. We've been together 2 months now, Michael, and it's time we stopped hiding in corners, especially if everyone around us has figured it out for a long time. It's not time yet. We've already done it with you. And more. She pouted her already puffy lips capriciously. She's always bossing everybody around. I understand. She's your ballet master, an important bird, all that. But I'm not a pig's tail either. I'm your favorite woman. Isn't that so? Isn't she or isn't she? Yes, darling, I am. But he stroked her leg. How do I explain this to her? Aren't you ready for a divorce? She asked. No. Michael admitted it, and it's not about you or her. It's just that I've put so much into this theater, and in a divorce, Betty and I have to share it. Betty, Nancy snorted. What tenderness. He hastened to correct his mistake. With Betty. But it doesn't matter, kitten, what you call her. What matters is that I mean, and you may be left without a theater. That's something to think about, and don't think it won't affect our income. The girl yawned defiantly. Honestly, I'd rather stay with Charles. He may be an undertaker, but he's a free man, with no wives or other pets. Nancy, Michael said reproachfully, but it was as if she hadn't heard him. What's there to catch? Your fool always walks around with her lips puckered, and you only spank me for nothing. You're afraid to get a divorce. So what's the point of me hanging around here? And in a corps de ballet. No, Michael, I think I'm gonna get out of here. There's no prospects here, only nerves. She stood up, stretched cat-like and flexible. Don't call me Nancy. Michael grabbed her arm, desperation in his eyes. Nancy, wait, let's talk. What do you want? Don't go, kitten. Don't leave me. I agree. I'm a fool for creating this situation. I don't know how to get out of it, but give me time, I'll figure it out. Please, Nancy, never before had he felt so helpless and pathetic. Never before had he had to beg for anyone for anything. I'll sort it out, Nancy. You just wait, just a little longer, just a little while longer, and then you and I will be together. She looked at him, not hiding a contemptuous smile. Michael saw it, understood it, and did not care. Let her despise him. Let her not consider him a human being at all. I don't care, but let her stay close to him. Her look, her warm skin, those soft lips, all this became for him a drug, without which life lost all meaning. I've never loved anyone as much as you, he confessed. Various things happened to me. Everything was, both bad and good. But to go so crazy about a woman? Never. I cannot without you. I'll think that you left me, and then why should I live? Fool, she said almost fondly. What will change in a week? A month, even a year from now? You will still shake with fear for this theater, from his wife encrypted without end. I don't want to be like that. I'll think of something. Michael said again, you just wait a little longer. As Nancy was leaving the office, she almost ran into Betty. Was Michael free yet? The dancer shook her head tiredly. No, and I'll be damned if he'll be free of you. Although, personally, I wouldn't mind at all. Betty was taken aback. You, Nancy, are you showing up to work drunk now, too? I'm going to talk to Michael right now. Talk to whoever you want. Talk to your brains, if you've got any, of course. I've had it. Nancy bellowed. If you're so blind and you can't see that Michael loves me, and you're already there for him. She walked past, hitting her rival hard with her shoulder. I'll never set foot in your theater again. She shouted goodbye. You can dance around without me, and I'll be there for you. Betty remained standing in front of the door of her husband's office. No, it was a lie and hypocrisy to say that she did not notice anything. She was quite aware of Michael's reasons for even taking a shower with his phone. And these sudden absences from the house, supposedly to get an hour's air, and lingering well into the night. She guessed, of course, but she preferred not to dwell on those suspicions. After all, thinking and knowing were not the same thing. The only thing she couldn't assume was that her husband was having an affair at work, somewhere on the side, yes, perhaps, but to be so blatant, right in front of her nose. Betty slowly turned around and, without looking in Michael's office, wandered toward the exit. As always, in moments of serious upheaval, she wanted only one thing, to be home as soon as possible. Michael, hearing her footsteps, sighed with relief. He sat at his desk, looking at the message from his mistress. I've worked out a way for us to arrange things. Meet me in half an hour near the drugstore across from the theater. I'm waiting. Don't be late. Betty was not at all anxious for her husband to return from work. In fact, she hoped he'd be late again. She'd never been good at and didn't like confrontation. Come to think of it, had she ever had occasion to do so? No, she hadn't. And now there is. What should she say to her husband? Darling, do I know you're having an affair with someone else? And if he denies it, that's easy. Or another option, even more idiotic. Michael, do you have a mistress? Yes, I do. Is it Nancy? Yes, it is. What to say next was a complete mystery. Or else. Her thoughts were interrupted by the phone ringing. Betty picked up the receiver. Yes? Hello, Mouseful. Nancy's voice on the other end of the line was surprisingly cheerful. Did it get through to you? Dumbass that he doesn't care about you? And he won't care as long as he has a woman like me by his side. You're not with him. Betty snapped at him, but Nancy only laughed even louder. Not yet, but soon. Well, I've had enough of you, C.O. loser. And Nancy hung up. Betty suddenly laughed to herself. Everything that was happening, this Nancy talk, her unbridled rudeness, it was all so absurd that it made her laugh involuntarily. And Betty laughed for a long time, at the top of her voice, until suddenly tears sprang from her eyes. Michael, fortunately, had not yet arrived, and Betty had no need to lock herself in the bathroom to cry in peace. Her life with her husband couldn't be called happy, but she wasn't miserable either. Michael had been primed for success ever since he was a child. An excellent student and the only gold medalist in their graduating class, sports dancing, athletics. He always read a lot. And in high school, the first went to preparatory courses and did it not by choice and insistence of parents and himself. And that's why Betty always liked not him, the perfect schoolboy and the embodied dream of his parents and teachers, but the cheerful Charles. They had been friends since they were very young. Michael, Charles, and Betty. Michael often joked that he remembered his wife even earlier than he remembered himself. Michael was the most serious of the trio, Charles the boldest, and Betty the centerpiece. They were never bored together. And what is surprising, their close circle, all three of them, carefully guarded from outsiders. For many years, in fact, since kindergarten and preschool graduation, no one had managed to join their company. And then the final bell rang and Charles left. Betty experienced his departure as a real tragedy. She'd never told anyone she'd been in love with Charles since 8th grade, not even her mom. And after graduation, he has shocked her by announcing that he was leaving, probably for good. Michael, for some reason, was not very surprised by this. They must have already discussed it without her. Betty decided that she would definitely come to the train to see Charles off and at least open up to him when saying goodbye. She had gotten up terribly early that morning, and that was all just so she could get her hair done, choose a suitable dress, and have time to do her makeup. She really wanted Charles to remember her beautiful, very, very beautiful. Michael had promised to pick her up at 9:30 in the morning, but he called at 8. "Did you sleep it off?" he asked cheerfully. "Well, don't cry. Charles is not angry. He said to say hello to you." "What hello?" Betty was confused. "You said he had a train at 9 o'clock. I'm all packed. I'm just waiting for you." "Oh, Mother, you've heard the wrong thing. I told you several times that Charles decided to take the night train." Michael laughed into the phone. "No, Betty, you've really got it all wrong." "How did I get it wrong, Michael?" "I had it written down." She argued, realizing that it didn't matter now. Charles had left anyway. "You know what? Go to bed." Michael suggested it. "With all these exams, you've gone completely out of your mind. You should get some rest, Betty. You'll sleep. You'll be fine. Do you want me to pick you up tonight and take a walk?" "Yeah, we'll go for a walk." Betty hung up the phone and looked at her reflection in the mirror. How pathetic it had seemed to her, the hair, the dress, the slightly tinted lips. Now it all seemed like a rejected gift, the kind of gift that had been long and carefully chosen, carefully wrapped, and when it came time to present it, it had been glanced at and sent to the pile of cards and silly souvenirs. Charles was gone, and we could wash our faces and straighten our curls. Betty lay on the bed and cried into her pillow. At the same time, Michael brushed his hair and left the house. It was 8:40, and he would still have time to get to the train station and see his friend off. Michael did not stay anywhere that evening. He entered the apartment and from the threshold shouted cheerfully, "Betty, I'm home. Where are you?" She was about to answer that she was in the kitchen, but changed her mind. He'd behear himself. "Betty, are you asleep? What's the matter with you?" He looked into the bedroom and, not finding his wife there, grumbled something resentfully to the tray. Finally, it was the kitchen. "Ah, there you are hiding." Michael rejoiced. "Why don't you answer? I've been looking all over the house for you. Look, a surprise." He pulled out a box of chocolates tied with a huge bow from behind his back with a deft gesture of a magician. "Your favorite." I know. You can't have sweets. You have to keep in shape. And that's the right thing to do, by the way. But they caught my eye, and I couldn't resist." Betty thanked him for the gift with a nod. "Shall we have tea?" Michael put the cup in front of his wife and untied the bow on the box himself. "Get to it. Once every couple of months you can forget about the figurine, can't you? Come on, a couple of candies won't hurt. Your mistress called today." Without raising her eyes from the table, Betty reported. Her husband hummed, pouring tea. "Wow! Which one?" "I've had 8 or 12 of them in the last week. I don't remember exactly." "Stop clowning around," she said. "Please, Nancy." Betty took the candy and bit into it absent-mindedly. It was too much to go on with the conversation about everything she'd had to hear from the cheeky girl today. "Nancy?" Michael said in astonishment. "Wait, you mean you think I'm having an affair with Nancy?" "With her?" He leaned back in his chair and laughed loudly. "But honest to goodness, Betty." He squeezed out between fits of laughter. "If you're going to think of such a thing, why, Nancy? I'd have expected more imagination from you." "Because," replied the wife in a steady voice, she spoke to me today," and Betty waved her hand in the air. "Michael, my eyes are blurring. Help me, I can't get to the bed by myself." Her husband ran over to her and helped her up. "Come on, Betty, come on." "Brr." "It's dark." Betty woke up to the cold. "Michael, would you turn up the heat and get me a blanket? It's freezing." No one answered her, and that was a shame. "Jesus." Betty grumbled unhappily. "Why is it that when you have to, there's no one? And when you don't, it's everyone?" She opened her eyes, threw back the sheet, and sat up. "What?" Betty didn't recognize her bedroom. White-tiled walls, white-tiled floor, she was sitting on a hospital gurney, and there was another one next to it. The person lying on it was covered head to toe with a sheet. Even his face was covered. "It was a nightmare," she muttered. "This is a dream, isn't it?" "Just a dream." "What kind of game?" Her quiet voice sounded deafening in the silence. It seemed to bounce off the walls and resonate. "What is it, Michael?" "Michael? Oh, my God, what is this? Am I in the morgue or something?" Betty jumped off the gurney, hit the neighboring one, and only now I understood everything. And having understood, I pressed my palm to my mouth, not to scream with horror. A human hand with blue, dead skin fell out from under the sheet. Betty rushed to the locked door and pounded on it with her fists. "Open up, whoever's in there, do you hear me? Open up, damn it, I'm alive. Open up right now. Anybody there?" There were hurried footsteps at the door, and the door swung open. A scared young guard stared at Betty with widened eyes. "What are you doing here? How did you get in here?" "We'll find out." She tossed it past him like a hurricane. "Call your superiors, come on. Call them right now. And shut this morgue down, for God's sake." Betty looked around. She'd seen this somewhere before. Well, familiar interiors. Charles, Is the owner here? Is he? Well, call him right now and tell him Betty's locked in the fridge. What, Betty? You tell him and he'll figure it out. Call him. The kid, who hadn't come to his senses yet, flapped his eyes and poked his finger at the numbers on the screen. At last the long calls rang out, and Betty stopped darting from corner to corner. What a showcase, she said, at the several coffins displayed along the walls of the roof. Jolly good business your boss has, boy, said. On his way, mumbled the guard. What were you doing, sleeping? Betty asked angrily. Have you seen anyone here? No one. He wrinkled his forehead funny. I would have noticed, but the morgue has a back door, so they bring them in from there. I see, she sighed. Do you have any tea? I was lying in a morgue, not on a beach. Charles arrived half an hour later, and at the sight of Betty, froze in place. She was still frozen, pale and rubbing her palms together furiously. You know, he said confusedly, I had hoped until the last moment that this was all some kind of stupid prank. I wish I'd thought so. Charles, what's going on? I'm so lost, I don't understand anything. Charles came over to her, rolled her up in his jacket, hugged her tightly around the shoulders. Let's go to my office, Betty. You'll get warm, we'll have coffee. I don't understand anything yet. What about you? You don't remember anything at all. How did you get here? Well, I was at home, then Michael came over, we had tea and talked. And then, Charles. She stared at her friend in shock. Charles, I think I figured it out. Michael brought a box of chocolates. We had tea with candy, Charles. So, he didn't get it. What's that got to do with it? I ate a candy, just one, and I got dizzy. Even my eyes got blurry somehow. I asked Michael to help me to the bed. There was something in the candy in it. You know now? Well, all right. Let's say, Charles nodded. So you got dizzy and went to lie down. Then how did you get here? Betty covered her face helplessly with her hands. I don't know anything at all, Charles. Maybe I'm just crazy already. He stroked her head. Betty, I've thought of something. I'm going over to your house right now. Don't. There, maybe there. You have to. With a little pressure, he said. I have to. Tell me, who else might I meet there? Betty lost her brow. Well, this one, Nancy, I didn't want to tell you. Anyway, Michael and Nancy. Right? Don't go on. Charles interrupted. I got the gist of it. Betty shook her head. How ridiculous, how unconscionable. She looked up at Charles tiredly and smiled. Why did you have to leave on the night train? Would things have turned out differently if I had come to see you off? The night train? He asked in surprise. I took the morning train, and I was very upset that you didn't come to say goodbye. Michael told me you had the flu, and you're lying there with a fever. Michael told you. What flu? What fever? I got up bright and early. I was doing my makeup so that you'd remember me like this? Beautiful. And then Michael called, even grumbled that I didn't see you off, didn't show up for the train. He also said I'd got it all wrong, what you told me about the night. So he just didn't want us to meet. Is that it? But why, Charles? It was always the three of us together. And Charles suddenly remembered the last summer they'd spent together, when Betty's parents had taken her to the sea, and he and Michael, 17-year-old boys, had gone to Charles's grandmother's cottage. There they had enough of everything, and the endless sky above their heads, and the green forest, and there were water bodies all around. You could fish or swim. The friends, having quickly managed to manage the household, burned a fire on the shore, roasted caught fish on it, and bathed in the lake without end. I bet I can swim across, Charles boasted. 15-round trip? Or shall we race against each other? Sit down already. Michael laughed. He ate too much and decided to go in the water. Are you suicidal? Come on, Michael, just admit you're weak. Charles, as always, was a gambler, and Michael, knowing this, was genuinely amused, looking at his friend. I'm weak. He didn't deny it. I've got a good head, don't you? Charles snorted indignantly. Time me. He ran into the water, making a fountain of spray. Michael looked seriously at his watch and then at his friend's head, which was already in the middle of the lake. Swim back, he shouted with sudden alarm. He could not explain why he was suddenly so afraid. Charles could swim as well as a dolphin, and how many times they had swum across the lake together and alone could not be counted. But Michael suddenly became cold, as if frost had fallen on him in the middle of a summer night. Charles, no one answered him. Get back, shouted Michael, already frightened. Swim back, Charles. He was already rushing toward the water, still shouting and calling for his friend. He realized that it was useless, but he had to be in time. He swam, and it seemed to him that the lake water, familiar from his childhood, had become as viscous as honey. It was difficult to break through it, and his shoulders were already inhumanly aching from the strain. Hold on, Michael whispered. He swam toward the middle of the lake where he had last seen Charles. Hold on. He gathered more air into his chest and dived in. Almost immediately something silky came under his arm. He clutched the hair tightly in his fist and jerked it to the surface. Charles let out a loud convulsive breath. Ashole, Michael hissed, almost drowned for crying out loud. He swam, supporting his friend, then dragged him out onto the sand. And all the while, every time, every second, he wanted desperately to punch Charles in the insolent face. Only the face was pale and so frightened that he couldn't get his hand on it. Cramp? He asked. Charles smiled smugly, and his eyes twinkled with laughter. No. A mermaid dragged her to the bottom. You should have seen what she had. He gestured to the parts of the mermaid's body that impressed him especially. Here Michael could not stand it, and the friends laughed so loudly that they scared away a bird in the bushes. Thank you, friend, said Charles, laughing. You saved my life, and now I am in your debt. Michael patted him silently on the shoulder. They returned to this conversation almost a year later, just before graduation. Remember, I'll continue? Michael asked, as if by the way, but that time at the lake. Charles looked at him questioningly. I remember, you can forget that. Then, Michael continued, Give in to Betty? I know you have a soft spot for her, but I'm not playing around. I want to marry her. Charles put his head down. You have a soft spot. Michael, being the considerate guy he is, I didn't mean it. I know you love her. Love her? What can you do against first love? He both wanted to tell Betty and was afraid to. But how she'd ridicule him and send him away with all his tender feelings. Could it be like that? Surely it could, but still, in the back of his mind, Charles cherished the hope that one day they could talk frankly and maybe even Betty could reciprocate. And now Michael had taken that hope away from him, and he hadn't really. He just knew his friend owed him a favor, so he demanded repayment. The thought flashed through his mind, was it a friend? Charles knew for a fact that if he had saved Michael, he would never have reminded him of that. The thought was too frightening, and Charles hurried to push it away. Duty is duty, isn't it? In a low voice, Michael reminded him. Charles turned away. I'll be gone after graduation. He promised briefly. Betty stood up. "Shall we go to my place together?" she said. I had new questions for my husband. He was mean to me the other day. He knew everything and he did it. How is that fair? And I was waiting to hear from you, and then Michael told me you had a girlfriend here. What a torrid affair. By the bewilderment on Charles's face, she guessed it was another one of her husband's tricks. And then, she finished sadly. I decided that it was a train wreck, so I agreed to go out with Michael. Then I married him. Charles sighed and took Betty's hand in his. "I'm sorry," he said, running his fingers over hers. "I'm sorry. It's my fault for bringing Nancy to you. If it hadn't been for that, stop it." Betty waved him away. "But it wouldn't have been Nancy. It would have been someone else. Who knows who? Your Nancy only brought out what was hidden. Like litmus paper, like they used to show us in chemistry at school. You dip it in a reagent, it changes color. That's Nancy. She's the reactant, and Michael's the paper." "Well, are we sitting down?" "Let's go." "No," Charles told her firmly. "If we want to find out what happened to you, I have to go alone. In the meantime, you wait here for me, okay? There's tea, coffee, some cookies. You want to put on a movie and wait for me. I'll be back soon, but in the meantime, there's something you need to remember. I think they wanted to get rid of you, to kill you. Isn't that strange to you? Me? I'm not. If you and Michael had just gotten divorced, you'd be entitled to half of everything you'd made. And someone didn't like that, someone who wanted it all. Nancy? Michael wouldn't. Maybe she would. But to get to the bottom of this, we need them to come forward. And that's why we're going to go like this. Look, Nancy stretched out across the marital bed and smiled sweetly, Michael. Isn't this a great idea? In a couple hours, your bitch will wake up. You'll take her home, and she'll tell everyone she woke up in the morgue. That's a full-blown delusion, and then you're in the psych ward, insanity plea, guardianship. And then you're free. And most importantly, the theater will belong to you alone. And Betty? He asked hoarsely. What will happen to her? Michael did not share his mistress's enthusiasm. On the contrary, with each passing minute he felt more and more acutely that something terrible had happened, and the worst of it was not without his active participation. How did he dare to do such a thing? Disability pension. Nancy laughed. What's the matter with her? We'll find her some cozy boarding house with a forest nearby with a river, and we'll see to it that she's properly looked after. About 50 years she will easily live, only in peace and quiet. It's a dream of many. If you want to know, maybe some amateur club will organize there. See how good it is that I made a copy of the key to the Charles of the afterlife in time. But don't you think I'm adorable? She held out her arms to him. Well, come to me. Michael grinned crookedly, but did not take a step toward the girl. For some reason he felt creepy. Today Nancy had interfered with his wife, and tomorrow, to take possession of the theater, she would quickly think of a way to get rid of him. She'll think of a way to get rid of him, you can be sure of it. Suddenly he remembered how, about a couple of weeks after Nancy's arrival at the theater, his wife had complained to him that their company was going through a bad patch. I don't know what that's all about. One of the leading dancers was hit by a car not far from the theater. Now the girl was lying with fractures on the stretching, and there's absolutely no one to replace her because half of the Corps de Ballet girls have some strange allergies. Girls with red spots all over their bodies, lined up at the dermatologist. Could be something in the concert clothes? In the fabric, said the doctor. The girls rewashed their costumes with hypoallergenic powder, but a day later their strange ailment returned. They're scratching themselves until they bleed. Betty was almost hysterical. The concert dresses are all revealing. How could they let girls like that on stage and no one for the lead? But maybe Nancy will give you a chance to prove yourself. He suggested it. After all, she's the only one who doesn't itch yet, and her legs are intact. Try it. If she's on an emotional high, she'll do something great. Betty, of course, sighed and wailed, but finally agreed. However, Nancy showed nothing but laziness. After the performance, Betty returned her to the Corps de Ballet. Michael was terribly upset about it, especially because Nancy had been angry for 2 weeks and barely spoke to him. Why was he bringing it up now? Were you the one who went off on the girl the other day? He asked in a whisper. Nancy squinted at him. At Vanessa, I thought you'd be quicker on the uptake. What was there to do? Do you think your inadequate wife would have given me the lead? But you could have. He was interrupted by the doorbell. It was Charles. Charles, what are you doing here? Michael, not now. He held up his hand warningly. I went to pick up some papers today, and the orderlies said there was an unknown woman frozen in the morgue. I went to look and recognized Betty. What? Michael shouted wildly. Charles, are you lying? I mean, she's. You're lying. I'm not lying. Sadly, Charles replied. She died of hypothermia. I don't know what to say, Michael. Nancy stood stone-faced on the threshold of the bedroom. Michael. She called softly, but he, his face twisted with savage rage, lunged at her. Nancy squealed. Charles pounced behind her, pulling his friend away from the girl. It was all her. Michael howled. She made the whole thing up. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to kill her. Yeah, what are you talking about? Charles shouted at both of them. What have you done? She told me it wasn't dangerous. She said. Charles looked at Nancy. What did you do? Was this all your idea? The girl shrugged her shoulder. Why the hell should I live like a beggar? Because that coward is afraid to divorce his gray mouse. What are you looking at? Yeah, it was my idea. I convinced that slug that his woman wouldn't freeze to death. Would he have agreed if he'd known? Michael's awake. What's going to happen now? To all of us, to me. Charles, I didn't mean to. But don't you believe me? Charles, I didn't mean it. Of course you didn't. Nancy grinned contemptuously. He didn't want to. He wanted the theater, Betty at home and me at night. Didn't he? Charles involuntarily stepped back from the girl. She was so repulsive to him that he was afraid she would touch him with the edge of her dress. Charles collapsed on his knees. Michael, don't ruin it. What do we do now, Charles? What do we do? Shut up. Charles, stop whining. It doesn't help. Let's all go to the morgue, take the body and dump it in the river before dawn. There's no telling what could have happened. She went for a swim and her leg cramped up. Will they believe that? Michael moaned. He sat on the floor with his fingers in his hair. No, you can't do that. Who would believe it? There's no other way out anyway. Charles cut him off. And in a couple of days, you'll have to report your wife missing before they find her. Get up, Michael, get up. Let's go. And you. He looked at the girl. You too. Me? Yeah, and you. Jump to his feet, Michael. You made the whole thing up. And now you want to get out of it. No way. Get in the car, now. Charles lost his patience. They drove for a long time in silence, broken only by Michael's sobs. He was scared. Only now he realized how right Charles had been when he had warned him not to get involved with Nancy. It would be worth it. That's what he'd said then. He hadn't listened to him. He thought Charles had been jealous, But it turned out that Nancy was a monster who had completely subjugated him and made him a murderer. "I hate you." He exhaled. "You scum, you bastard. I hate you. You only think you do." The girl smiled. She had regained her usual composure and will cease to seem as soon as you realize how many problems I have saved you. No need to fray nerves in court, divorce, divide the property. "Shut up," screamed Michael. "Shut up? You're a murderer." "Both of you shut up," said Charles from his seat. "Both of you." The funeral home was bright. "The morgue is down the hall to the right," said Charles. "Is she in there?" Michael asked in a trembling voice. "In the morgue?" No. The door to Charles' office swung open and Betty stepped in. "Good night, you bastards." "Did everything work out, Charles?" "Of course it did." He took the tape recorder out of his pocket. "It's all here. I think it's enough to send them to a place not so far away." "No," Michael whispered, backing up against the wall. "No, no, no." He shook and fell to his knees, crossing himself, muttering as if he were casting a spell. "No, no, no. Without me." Suddenly Nancy laughed and rushed across the hall to the door. "She'll run away." Betty gasped. Charles shook his head. "Don't worry about it. The police are waiting for him, and this one." He nodded disgustedly at Michael, who had given up crossing and mumbling and was now just quietly swaying from side to side. "This one won't need to be detained. Come in and get him." "What's going to happen now?" Betty said softly as Michael, sobbing and mumbling again, was led out of the bureau. "What's going to happen now, Charles?" He put his arm around her, stroked her shoulder. "You need to get some sleep now. That's the first thing." "I'm not going home." Betty shivered. "I don't want to go there ever again." "It's not my home anymore." "Then let's go to my place," said Charles. "Take a bath, get some sleep, and then we'll figure out how to live our lives. And you?" "I'll sleep on the sofa, like in better times." Charles winked at her, and then they drove through the crazy city night, and Charles deliberately took his time because they had so much to talk about. And Betty suddenly felt really happy for the first time in years because there was a road to drive on, and Charles was there, so safe and easy to be with, and at the end of the night she had a bath and a chance to sleep. Is it too much to be happy?